Morning. I am here to help you set up anything that you might need. I'm a volunteer. Do you need anything to get set up? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm just a speaker, so I just joined the meeting, so I don't know.
Okay, no worries. I will come back in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Hi there. I'm a volunteer with PAMLA. Can I help you guys with anything? Do you need any help getting set up?
So as of yet, we are doing good, Michelle.
Okay,
Okay.
awesome. If you need anything at all, you can just search my name in the message app and I'll be able to help.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a great panel.
Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. So welcome to PMLA 2021. We are going to start our panel now. Thank you so much for waiting, everyone. We were having a few issues we were dealing with. So we have with us today in person, Catherine and Sam, right here in the room. And Polome and I are also kind of in the same room. And Jeremy is also kind of participating with Sam and Catherine. So we are all in person. So it's wonderful to meet all the other panelists out there. Hi, everyone. It would have been so much fun if we were all together, but life does its own things. But here we are, working over virtual mediums, and Holly and Catherine, I think, have particular things to say about that. So let's start the panel. I'm just going to start by introducing Holly, and then for Holly's presentation, we are going to play the presentation, the recorded one, because she's presenting on something that has embedded videos and presentations, which would have been difficult for her to share on screen. So she has sent us a recorded lecture that would be easier for her to kind of play. So we're going to watch that and have Holly all the while. And the way I'm thinking, and since Polome is in the same room, Polome, do we all have the papers at first and then take all the questions at the end? What do you think? Or should we take 10 minutes after each? I think maybe taking all the questions at the end would be good.
I think that's the way to go.
So you need to turn off the, yeah, okay. Yeah, you can just talk to me, okay. And also, okay, so I guess I'll just start by introducing Holly. So Holly Parker is an associate lecturer and PhD researcher at the University of Lincoln. Her paper feeds into a bigger project researching of affect and performance within a corpus of 21st century novels. These novels see non-professional performers using methods of performance, such as Minecraft avatars in Keith Stewart's novel A Boy Made of Black Blocks, and performing as Prospero in Margaret Atwood's Hagseed, to achieve affects that contrast their depression and everyday systems of self-management. To what end are characters turning to performance to experience pleasure, love, pain, shame, etc.? And how does this performance reflect wider trends in relationships and emotion in 21st century? Holly, over to you through a virtual platform. If you want to say hi to everyone before we share your video, you could totally do that.
Hello, I'll just say hello from across the pond. It's very nice to see you all, and yeah, you'll understand with the way that the animations are embedded why I've presented in this way. But also, when I'm talking about technology, it feels quite fitting to present that by video as well. So I shall see you on the other side.
This paper focuses on Ernest Cline's novel Ready Player One and how it engages more broadly with life in a digital age. I will interrogate the representation of avatars in the novel, with a particular interest in how its protagonist, a teenager named Wade, performs as the avatar Parzival in a virtual world called the Oasis to experience love, happiness, and escape from the loneliness of the novel's dystopic setting. To escape the depression Wade experiences in real life, he must create boundaries between the material and virtual worlds. This is achieved through a process of logging in and out. However, these boundaries are not absolute, for Wade wears a haptic suit to simulate virtual sensations in real life, and creates what I argue is an effective membrane between the virtual and material worlds. In-game sensations are reproduced onto Wade's body through the suit, simulating pleasure and pain, though, as the term membrane suggests, this technology also mediates affects. For as soon as the suit is removed, Wade no longer experiences those virtual sensations. Ready Player One, then, presents a complex negotiation between player and avatar. The affects that Wade experiences are within the Oasis, creating a safe and clearly demarcated zone, but these distinctions also smudge. The distinctions between virtual and material affect throughout the chapter contribute to current conversations on the corporeality of affect, and this novel opens a conversation into how characters are using virtual reality, demonstrating the complexity of negotiating relationships in what Muriel and Crawford call the Cyborgian Age. This paper is part of a larger project that interrogates affect and performance within 21st century fiction. I have an interest in a phenomenon that sees non-professional performers utilising what I call demarcated performance zones to experience love, pleasure, shame, etc. And I am researching how these affects are part of a complex negotiation in a technocentric culture that operates neoliberalist systems of self-management. I started researching Ready Player One during the months preceding the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, interested in the extent digital technology has replaced face-to-face contact and how we are learning to renegotiate our relationships in accordance to this. Then, on the 23rd of March 2020, Boris Johnson announced that the virus had reached pandemic status and the country was on lockdown. Suddenly, people were only able to communicate via video call. Virtual house party and Zoom groups were being created to fill the void left by human contact. My research had never felt timelier. Aptly, Ready Player One presents a dystopic 2045 where people are turning to virtual realities to form relationships. My interrogation of this novel reflects aspects of the current and ever-changing situation and contributes to those discussions into how people are using virtual reality and the complexity of living in this increasingly digital age. Ready Player One is set in a dystopic 2045 and narrated by Wade, a teenager who spends all his time inside a virtual universe called the Oasis. The Oasis is a vast virtual platform that contains planets, games, chat rooms, zones, libraries and film archives that encapsulate many players' entire existence. When the creator of the Oasis, James Halliday, dies, he leaves his last will and testament with the legal rights to the Oasis hidden in an Easter egg. An Easter egg is a colloquial term for a bonus object hidden within a video game or film. The players join a platform-wide competition to capture the egg. These players are affectionately called gunters, a portmanteau of egg hunters, and after a series of virtual challenges that include 1980s arcade games such as Joust, and role-playing as film characters in Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Wade successfully wins the Easter egg, gaining control of Halliday's company, which he shares with the 3 avatars/players with whom he forms close friendships. Wade uses the Oasis to escape material reality, and does so by separating himself from society. For example, to log in, he first enters his refuge, an abandoned van IRL that he has repurposed. This space is already contained and marks the first layer of escape from his dystopic reality. Wade must then don the appropriate equipment and initiate the login sequence to transport him into the Oasis. He dons a haptic suit and completes a ceremony of a retinal scan and verbally recites a long speech that acts as a password. Then, the words Ready Player One fill the screen, and Wade states that this signals that he is leaving the real world and entering the virtual one. The login process creates a sense of immersion within the virtual world, and Wade is separated from real life, demarcating the performance zone in which Wade becomes parsable. The process of demarcation separates Wade from the depression and isolation he experiences IRL, and allows the Oasis to become an escape hatch to a better reality. For example, Wade narrates that if I was feeling depressed or frustrated about my lot in life, all I had to do was tap the Ready Player One button, and my worries would instantly slip away as my mind focused itself on the relentless pixelated onslaught on the screen in front of me. When Wade logs in, his depression slips away, and the use of escape also suggests that the Oasis and the real world are distinct. The process of establishing boundaries between the Oasis is what enables the process of escape itself. As Daniel Muriel and Gary Crawford's work on video games argues, when we seek to establish a boundary that demarcates and differentiates different realms, the real and the virtual, then crossing that boundary becomes a form of escape. Wade actively logs in, and the process of logging in crosses the threshold into the virtual realm, marking this escape. However, in order to experience love, happiness, pleasure, etc., the boundaries cannot be absolute. Rather, there is what I call an affective membrane that allows affects to pass between Wade and Parsable. After school finishes, Wade moves to an apartment, and his inability to truly separate himself from the outside world is demonstrated in his description of the flat. He blacks out the windows and owns no furniture apart from the haptic chair. He claims that I decided that everything outside the window was a distraction. I didn't want to hear the outside world either, but I hadn't been able to improve upon the apartment's existing soundproofing. So I had to live with the muffled sounds of wind and rain, and of street and air traffic. He is unable to completely isolate himself from the real world, and the distinctions between the demarcated zone of the apartment dedicated to his life inside the Oasis is in fact penetrated by reality. Reality is still muffled and undergoes a process of mediation though, but this section demonstrates that despite Wade's desires, his existence in the Oasis cannot be entirely separate from his real life. His senses are still affected physically, and the boundaries between the Oasis and the real world are complicated rather than absolute. The haptic suit Wade wears to experience the Oasis also functions as an affective membrane that smudges the distinctions between the virtual and material, and permits Wade to experience pain. The suit is full body from the neck down, and acts as a technological skin that simulates the in-game sensations of touch from the virtual world to the body. Wade narrates, built into the inside of the suit was a web-like network of miniature actuators that made my skin feel things that weren't really there. They could convincingly simulate the simulation of a tap on the shoulder, a kick to the shin, or a gunshot in the chest. Here, the virtual world is brought into the physical plane when Wade experiences the audio, visual, and kinetic sensations of the virtual platform on their physical body, blurring the distinction between the simulation and material reality. Catherine Hale's work on immersion articulates how the phenomenon of VR technology make presence and absence seem irrelevant. She asserts, virtual reality put the user's sensory system into a direct feedback loop with a computer. From my experience with the virtual reality simulations, I can attest to the disorientating, exhilarating effect of feeling that subjectivity is dispersed through the cybernetic circuit. This disorientating effect takes place within Ready Player One. The suit convincingly simulates the events of the virtual world and transmits them onto the human body. This is key to Wade's experience of happiness, pleasure, and pain as possible. The suit specifically simulates the gunshot, which has been entirely constructed from computer code in the first instance. The process of simulation extends the performance zone from a purely virtual environment to a material one, creating not only a greater sense of immersion, but a real-world response. Contemporary video game theory also engages with the notion of embodied experience in VR, interrogating what the body means in a cyborgian age. Muriel and Crawford offer an overview of critical work in post-millennial video game culture and argue that when players engage with game worlds, they are not leaving their bodies behind. Rather, they support Larty's assertion that we remain flesh as we become machines. Muriel and Crawford's discussion of the body in video games proposes that the body is no longer independent to video game technology. Rather, they state that the body is necessarily distributed during play across virtual and actual worlds via the video game hardware, asserting that the video game action is not just happening on the screen, the mind, the senses, or the space in which players are, but is in fact distributed across both physical and simulated space. Here, according to Muriel and Crawford, the embodied experience of video gaming is thus that of a cyborgian, multiple, and promiscuous relationality. Through understanding video games as a cyborgian experience, Muriel and Crawford echo Donna Haraway's seminal Cyborg Manifesto and suggest that the human and machine operate symbiotically in video games. In the 21st century, portable technologies such as smartphones, smartwatches, smart glasses, tablets have changed our relationship with technology. In many ways, the smartphone is now an extension of the human body. Phones rarely leave the user's vicinity and are quite often carried in people's hands. The integration of technology within our lives has multiplied exponentially in the wake of COVID-19. People often complain about spending their time in back-to-back Zoom meetings, and a friend even stressed the need to de-Zoom after a day of working from home. Therefore, maintaining separate spheres for the body and technology no longer accurately reflects 21st century life. Wade's haptic suit and the effective membrane it creates demonstrates a way of experiencing affect that is representative of affect in what Muriel and Crawford call this cyborgian age. However, it is important to acknowledge how the affective potential of the haptic suit is complex, as the suit remains mediated. Wade clarifies that built-in safety software prevented my rig from actually causing me any physical harm, so a simulated gunshot actually felt like a weak punch. Wade feels physical pain at the impact of a gunshot, which troubles the layer that separates in-game and real-world experiences, but this pain is technologically altered. If the haptic suit is a membrane that allows interaction between body and the machine, then, simultaneously, the suit membrane mediates how much pain or other sensations Wade will actually experience. Moreover, if Wade removes the suit, he ceases to experience pain. The haptic suit presents an avenue to experience pain, but the technology also allows him to manage how much or how little he wishes to feel. Although Ready Player One is using advanced technology, this mediation is deeply rooted in our everyday lives. People are currently logging in constantly to experience friendships or work meetings, but at the click of the button, they can log off and separate themselves from that connection. Overall, Ready Player One depicts a character renegotiating their life in this digital age. Wade enters the Oasis to escape the real world, but also believes his true and better self exists through his performance as possible. Yet he cannot truly escape. The suit creates an effective membrane, allowing Wade to experience pain, and yet as technology allows us to become infinitely connected in this cyborgian age, it also permits a process of self-management. As soon as Wade logs out and turns off his VR headset, he returns to his one-room apartment, as an agoraphobic shut-in with no real friends, family, or genuine human contact. While the novel does present the oasis as an escape hatch to a better reality then, it does so while acknowledging the complexity and contradictions of negotiating an emerging form of digital technology. The ability to escape online is something at the forefront of many of our lives, and the ability to manage these relationships is something we are all figuring out. Technology, in many forms, is developing at such a rate that it is sometimes worth reminding ourselves that we are constantly trying to comprehend new updates, and that ultimately this is still a negotiation. Thank you.
Or do you want me to go there? So after a wonderful presentation by Holly, we are going to move next to the next presenter and have all the questions at the end as we decided. So hold on to our questions. Okay, so up next here we have, well, I have a personal connection to the person presenting next. We are long-term friends and colleagues, and now we are here forming a different professional relationship. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rohini Chakraborty, who was a project fellow for the RUSA project on locating indigeneity in the Global South, revival, conservation, and sustainability at Jadavpur University. After completing her post-graduation in comparative literature from Jadavpur University, she is currently pursuing an MPhil degree in comparative literature. From 2016 to 2018, she worked in the field of rural education among marginalized communities in remote areas of Uttar Pradesh in northern India as a teacher at Vidyagyan Shiv Nadar Foundation, an academy for the economically underprivileged meritorious students of rural India. Her research interests are Indigenous studies, education, gender studies. So Rohini, over to you. I'm just gonna mute myself.
Thank you, Ragini, for that very generous introduction. Hello, everyone. So I hope I'm audible. Yeah, okay, so I'll just begin. The title of my paper is A Look at the Indigenous Women of Canada and Their Fight Against Violence During the Pandemic. What I'm about to start with are a few quotes, so I'll just read them out and then I'll proceed. Federal Indigenous Services Minister urges Quebec's Premier to show humanity to homeless. COVID-19 vaccine delays top agenda as Parliament resumes. Meat plant workers should be on early COVID-19 vaccine list, union argues. Canada makes trade retaliation plans in case EU breaks vaccine promise. Fed urge provinces to keep COVID restrictions in place. Homeless people need priority for vaccines, shelter subsidies. Toronto Airport begins mandatory COVID testing as more variant cases found. COVID has illustrated systematic discrimination faced by Indigenous women. Bennett, Canada to donate 13 million surplus vaccine doses to poor countries. I decided to begin my paper with a few headlines that made it to the Canadian news during the peak of the pandemic earlier this year. The headlines that I read out just now were somewhere between the months of January and June. Now, what I would like to point out here, rather ask my audience to focus on, is the number of headlines that explicitly talk about the Indigenous communities of Canada that are a very important part of the population of the nation. While I could just fit in a few headlines here in this paper, I was absolutely flabbergasted by how scarce the number of national news talks about the Indigenous communities, and how there is not much discussion about how these communities are actually combating a pandemic like the COVID-19. Naturally, it is a given that much less has been spoken about and discussed about the Indigenous women who were already facing endless violence of rampant abduction, sexual abuse, and murder. Evidently, with the mandatory curfews, lockdowns, and everything, sudden drop in the economy, sealed borders, a question that popped in my mind was, how did these women, the Indigenous women, cope up with the situation? Marginalization for these Indigenous women happens on different levels, and that adds to their distress and danger. As it is now open to the world that the Canadian government's treatment of its Indigenous population has never been the role model that one would expect it to be. It is no secret that even after so many years of colonization, the inequality and discrimination towards these communities could not be eradicated completely. Issues like alcoholism, drug abuse, murder, suicide, illegal prosecution, high criminal charges, homelessness, and so on still infest the lives of all these community people. On top of that, the recent revelation of the massacres at the Indian residential schools only added to the sheer anguish of the Aboriginal people. The government even now fails to take the necessary steps in order to address these crippling matters, leaving the Indigenous communities with very restricted and little agency. With multiple issues already putting the Indigenous communities at a certain disadvantage, the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls have been a burning reality. Indigenous women statistically are at a more dangerous position than compared to the non-Indigenous female population. These women, who are already living at the boundary of all kinds of safety and security, are infested with the fear of death, rape, and abduction. Investigations in their cases are shamefully low, and whatever little justice is or could be served to these infinitely marginalized women, the indication of racism in the violence meted out to them is quite evident. A number of white-skinned men have been identified as probable accusers related to the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The accused, even if their crime is proven, have many times managed to escape any severe punishment. And this has only added to the sheer incompetency of a government that fails to protect its people. While researching for this particular topic, the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada, or the lack of relevant discussion thereof, of me, and I was intrigued to know how well or how difficult it has been for these women to sustain within a pandemic like the COVID-19. I'm talking about the women who are living in constant fear of their existence every single moment of their life. The worldwide curfew or lockdown, as we learned, as the term became a very common thing in our life nowadays, due to the pandemic, has increased the rate of violence and abuse against women in general. Thus, what situation has the Canadian women, the Canadian Indigenous women, been under became my main point of interrogation in this research paper. The few questions that I would like to raise and maybe try to address, to my best ability, are what happened to the ones who went missing before or during the lockdown? Could the government do anything to provide them the security or justice that was required? Did murders, abductions, rapes take place rampantly? How was the trauma dealt with? What measures of security were adopted by the government? Has the violence against women increased during the lockdown period? Being marginalized means you will never make it to the top of the priority list of your government, and an individual's identity has a lot to do in that selection. The indigenous communities of Canada are already sidelined and are yet not properly considered as mainstream. On top of that, being an indigenous woman entails double marginalization, and that makes the situation even more dire. A survey that was conducted in the early months of the year 2020 has shown that in a group of 250 indigenous women, 1 among every 5 female individuals were victims of physical or psychological violence. Sadly, the survey also revealed that these women were more worried about the domestic violence that they might face rather than being infected by a virus like the COVID-19. President Lorraine Whitman early on expressed her concerns regarding the safety of these women. The lockdown forced many of these indigenous women to stay confined or in close proximity with their abusers and their enablers. According to the Canadian government, an amount of $40 million was committed to ensure gender equality. From this, an amount of $40 million was reserved to give aid to shelters where distressed women would be taken care of. But sadly, none of these shelters provide much to the indigenous communities. They do not cater much to the indigenous women. So what happens is this lack of proper arrangement left the indigenous women at completely without any federal protection during a time like the COVID-19 lockdown. Even before the onset of the pandemic, the issue of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls was already a point of major discomfort for the Canadian government. Added to that, Michelle Odette, a commissioner who handled the missing and murdered indigenous women and girls inquiry, expressed her concerns about a national plan of action that was supposedly being employed. There were already delays in employing it, and she strongly believes even if something was done before the pandemic set in, it would have done very little to better the situation of the indigenous women of the nation in any way. Statistics say that during the month of May 2020, 17% of the indigenous women experienced extreme violence in the preceding month, as compared to the 10% in the year 2014. The sudden lockdown and overall fall in the economy has been hugely responsible for the increased violence. These indigenous women are in some way or the other impacted by the financial instability that became a major problem during the COVID-19. Recently, the tragedy of Gabby Petito shook the world, but the prompt action by the US police was much appreciated, while justice was served to Gabby without much delay. The indigenous women of Canada and US as well are not so lucky. In the year 2020, 22-year-old Caitlin Kelly of Menominee Reservation community went missing. It took the authority 9 long months before they could locate any of her remains. This is just one example out of the many cases of discrimination that even a worldwide pandemic could not cure. The COVID-19 pandemic has not been any kinder to these women. With extremely questionable healthcare systems catering to the reservation, the general health of these women has been compromised. With gendered violence at a peak, the indigenous women simply lack any sort of security from their government. In the year 2020, the Canadian government announced that because of the onset of the pandemic, the national inquiry into the multiple cases of murdered and missing indigenous women and girls would not meet the June deadline. This inaction in the part of the government is bound to have a long-term effect on the communities and their women. Here, I would like to quote Lorraine Whitman to point out how this inaction of the government is nothing but another proof of their inefficiency. I quote, "They're using the pandemic as an excuse. We are in crisis as indigenous women, the crisis of COVID and the crisis of violence, and they are both inseparable. Thus, it is understandable that by delaying the missing and murdered indigenous women and girls inquiry, it will definitely negatively impact the women who are already at great risk of different kinds of violence, abuse, and murder." Sorry. The pandemic has shown that it does not discriminate between the status, color, caste, or creed of human beings. But sadly, that was not enough for us, the human beings, to eradicate discrimination that we constantly inflict upon the ones weaker than us in any way. The rapid rise in violence against the indigenous women has been alarming, but the way the government has decided to tackle it has been deemed disappointing in many ways. John Lavelle Harvard, the president of the Ontario Native Women's Association, has expressed that the need of a firm plan to rehabilitate abused women was a must during the pandemic. But the delay in taking proper action has only endangered these women further. The trauma of being vulnerable to the abuser has impacted the indigenous women psychologically, as they are left without much of an escape route due to the curfews and lockdowns. Obviously, with the missing and murdered indigenous women and girls inquiry being on hold, the families have been in constant distress. Even though walks, demonstrations, and protests have been arranged, it did not bring much of an alteration, which is really sad. With all this being said, I am still left with the question as to why justice should be different for different communities. Tragedy of one person can never be looked down upon or ignored because they are of liminal identity. They should not suffer because of an identity that they were born with and are proud of, which is very natural. Though our spokesperson from Bennett's office has assured, and I quote, "We are working to end this ongoing national tragedy and continue to do what is right and necessary to honor the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the LGBTQ and two-spirited people to foster the healing of the family survivors and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. The real actions have been really questionable." As I conclude, I understand that the scope of this paper is much larger than what has been addressed here. The Canadian government is still a very long way from providing any kind of reconciliation to the victims of gendered violence. Only time will tell if the government will be able to do their job in a fair way, so that the ones living on the margins are no more victimized. At the end, I would just like to give a disclaimer. I am not Indigenous. I am not Canadian. I live in India. I'm an Indian research scholar. So researching this issue has been a very enriching process for me, and I have tried my best to remain sensitive to the emotions and the information that I provide is accurate, even if after that I have given some flawed information or I have made a mistake. I truly apologize for that, and I'm always open to learning, and I would love for some questions to come after the session is over. Thank you. It was a pleasure speaking.
Oh my God.
We'll move on to our next paper. It's by two very young but very meritorious scholars in the making, and I'm really excited about them. So it's a co-presented paper by Catherine Marine and Samuel Mayer. Catherine Marine is an honor scholar at Binghamton University, majoring in psychology and linguistics with a minor in Spanish. She has served as a debate team president and as a psycholinguistics research assistant for Dr. Sang-Ju Lim. As a part of the freshman research immersion program, she completed a poster presentation titled Unexploded Ordnance Detection Using Remote Sensing. In addition, she received a grant from the Summer Scholars and Artists program to research resistance strategies and epistemic determinism. She will co-present this research as a paper titled terrorist liminalities at today's conference. And Catherine works as a research and argument strategist at Debate Boutique, where she has given lectures including Power in Academic Structures, Baudrillard, Deleuze, and the Death of God, and Queerness, a Question Posed. Our second presenter, Sam Mayer, is a student at Binghamton University pursuing a degree in sociology with a minor in linguistics and has consistently been on the Dean's list. He's presenting at PMLA 2021 on the liminal space as a lens through which to view identity. He's currently a volunteer at Riot Act, an anti-profit, community-led bookstore, mutual aid group, and radical organizing collective located in Binghamton. Sam has also received a grant from Binghamton's Summer Scholars and Artists Program to conduct original written research on theoretical and academic overdeterminism in radical epistemology. He specializes in semiotics and Marxism. That's a very impressive bio, and I can't wait to listen to their papers. All the best.
Great.
There we go.
Can we get thumbs up if people are good? Oh, we'll wait for the echo to stop. Really is the vibe for this week. All right, awesome.
All right, so we're good.
Okay. Oh, oops. Hi, everybody. I'm Catherine Marin,
I'm Sam Meyer.
and this is Terrorist Liminalities. Okay, wait, let's make sure that. So I want to start our presentation, I want to start by situating our presentation with our research question. Why do modern activist projects fail so spectacularly and so silently? This is a question we came to kind of organically and almost accidentally in our conversations with other leftists in the organizing process. We found, at least within our generation, that radicals are not struggling with a lack of awareness of crisis. Disaster capitalism and the information economy have kind of made sure of that. The issue, excuse me, is that we are resisting, we are protesting and calling our representatives and voting and even rioting, and it isn't working. And nobody knows why or what we can do to make our movements more materially effective. This is the grounds for our research questions. Why aren't our strategies working? What should we be doing? How can we be doing it differently to achieve structural and wide-scale change?
And we're going to start by situating this analysis in a historical moment we designate semio-capitalism or semiotic capitalism. This is an era that's distinct from industrial capitalism, having emerged from the outset of neoliberalism and proliferated by the expansion of the internet. At least in the West, this is where we see the rise in importance of consumption over production and the explosion of the information economy into something that looks more like what we have today. It is also important to note that, as Foucault indicates, the structures of power during industrial capitalism take the shape of a disciplinary society, which is characterized by vast and crowded but distinct enclosures that regulate individual behavior, whereas semio-capitalism's power structures lose their shape in what Deleuze would term a control society following the disciplinary, in which the borders of power structures are weakened or dissolved entirely and overlap, leading to far more subtle subjugation of our subject.
So, oh, I gotta switch the slide. Cool. So I'd like to ground our discussion with a recent example of the impact of the material, socio-political, semio-capital material conditions in the West on attempts at organizing. For anyone who's not familiar, on January 6th, a group of militant right-wing individuals illegally entered the Capitol with the intent to stop the confirmation of Joe Biden's election to the office of the president. So I began to research this issue in search of a discussion of what the goal was, the strategy and the vision of kind of the event. And I ran into issues pretty quickly. Pages and pages of articles covered every possible angle on the story. Political figures and media outlets worked in combination to craft a very particular narrative of the event, one of an attempted coup, of the intent to overthrow democracy, of a threat to the government. But there was a noticeable gap in this narrative. The fact that the protesters were able to enter the Capitol, many of them armed, was not contested. Why then had their plan not been carried out? How were all of these articles written to center on a secret plot, an intentional and very well-organized attempt to overthrow the government when the perpetrators made it to the symbolic finish line and did fundamentally nothing? What makes much more sense than the narrative that I found in a lot of these media interpretations is that a large but relatively disconnected group of individuals were able to rally around Donald Trump as a solution to their shared discontent. how exactly they were spurred to violence, why they decided to enter the Capitol, and most importantly, for my research, what their goal was, are questions with inconsistent and generally unintelligible answers. If there ever was a clear shared understanding of a method, goal, and justification responsible for January 6th, it was largely absent in my search through the media. And I sifted through hundreds of articles across dozens of news platforms, searching for a discussion of these points that was situated in testimony from the responsible parties. What I found instead was endless, unwarranted speculation. The event itself was a footnote to an over-proliferated media narrative on the imminent collapse of democracy, the rise of fascism, the threat of domestic terrorism, the death of the West, the conspiracy in the government, the end of the world. So let's see if I can zoom in so that these are a little bit more legible. Sure. So the important common themes by my reading are: first, the United States and the rights of its citizens are under attack and need to be saved. Second, the threat is the fault of some combinations of the communists, Antifa, AOC, Nancy Pelosi, somehow belonging to the same group, question mark. Third, our political representatives have a responsibility to hear our grievances and concerns, and those individuals are in the Capitol, or our political representatives are involved in this plot and must be stopped, and those individuals would also be in the Capitol. So the use of the word grievances used by the protesters to characterize their own desires implies unfair treatment, right? That something that was deserved has been denied, a sense of betrayal, which in my reading stems from the violation of a previously and generally upheld sense of entitlement. Franco Berardi's explanation of reactionary right-wing politics in Breathing, Chaos, and Poetry serves as a useful analytic frame. He argues that the, quote, white men of the Western world are plunging into a sort of mental mayhem based on impotence and self-loathing, end quote. The impotence in question is political in nature, and the self-loathing in relation to the feeling that these individuals have been denied, quote, the neoliberal promise of individual success, end quote. These young white men are not in any way prepared to face the reality that the American dream they were promised never existed in the first place and certainly will not describe their future. In combination, these factors produce a sense of desperation because there is no room to grieve this perceived loss, so must be prevented at all costs. The mission failed before it ever started, so answers, direction, explanations must be invented to rescue it from confusion, hopelessness, and disillusionment that echo from a maze of mirrors. Something is wrong. We know something is wrong. Why is this happening? Who is responsible? How do we stop it? In Baudrillard's words, the facts no longer have a specific trajectory. In the words of one of the perpetrators, it becomes impossible to know what is real and what is fake. And in that moment, whether or not a plan existed becomes an insufficient question, because these individuals didn't need a plan. All the modern subject needs is the feeling of movement in the direction of an imagined solution to a real problem. Let's see, we're going to the next section. So, in the current socio-political moment, many individuals conduct their theater of politics online, and the performance associated with theater is an essential frame because people assume the role of the online activist, the good activist, to correct the real in the safety of the virtual. In an era of pandemics, incredible police violence, precarity, and lackluster movement building, social media platforms present a space in which it is materially innocuous to play the activist, but in semiotic capitalism, the avenues for activism have been commodified, delegitimized, and generally rendered ineffective. All the while, this sustains the illusion of progress. It is now possible to make a social media post about a problem and feel that the job is done. After all, what else is there to do? This pulls the potential activist out of the political sphere. And even when online activists participate in real-world events or movements, it is often secondary to the sign value that they generate for the good activist that resides in the virtual and plays in the symbolic, a simulacrum of activism that endlessly proliferated through retweets, hashtags, and text posts, while our fearless activists sit at home, resharing a particularly poignant meme and going on to save the world. And this is the worst trick of power. It demands our labor, our responsibility, our empathy, that we each devote everything to make the world a better place, all the while urging us towards failure. This call is seductive in the current age of political disillusionment, but to place the blame for performative activism on online activists ignores that all of politics is performative. We have been writing legislation, passing bills, and changing the system for hundreds of years. Our pseudo-oligarchy, masquerading as a democracy, has had its chance to prove its worth as an agent of change. Quote, the problem is they know perfectly well what they are doing, but they continue doing it anyway, end quote, Andrew Kolb. It is ludicrous to think that if those in power wanted to lower carbon emissions, phase out fossil fuels for green alternatives, use international systems for peace, or embark on any number of humanitarian projects, that these things would not have already happened. So, If our goal is no longer politics and our medium is no longer the internet, our project must replace those things. In response to the fragmented power structures that Sam described, we need the kinds of networks that exist online to allow for any organizing that can be widespread and discrete enough to take on the radical projects we need. We argue that social media has been presented to us as exactly this, as a liminal space, which we characterize as an in-between, a space in transition, which allows for new connections and understanding, a perfect place for politics. But this frame is flawed because social media is designed to prevent exactly those kinds of interactions. Everything from the platform, which overdetermines the structure of our communications, to the algorithm, which locks us in political echo chambers, is designed to produce a simulation of politics while precluding material actions. In this way, social media is a simulated liminal space. So how can we generate liminal networks without falling into the trap of simulated activism? Yeah, we're going here. So we started this by developing a frame for analysis almost by accident, a linguistic accident that Jeremy Santora, who's also here, is responsible for. We were discussing the internet, and Jeremy said an internet. And as a linguistics major, the immediate discomfort that I and everyone in the room felt was a little confusing, right? Because there's no grammatical reason that an versus the should be wrong. We have a definite and indefinite article, we have a mass noun or a count noun. The only reason that that would feel wrong is if we've conceptualized the internet as a mass noun, i.e. as one overarching structure that contains all of its component parts. But there's no reason the internet has to be understood this way. An internet as a count noun allows for a multiplicity or a proliferation of internets, which Sam will talk about a little bit later. But what struck me in this instance was the absence in our collective understanding of an internet. There was a very strong presence of the internet that had overdetermined our understanding of the concept, which allowed me to arrive, at the idea of an absence frame. So, anyone who hopes for a better world, anyone who shares the desperate desire to resist should restart their search for answers by asking, what has been kept from me? What aren't we allowed to do? What is absent? When faced with a power characterized by illusion, enigma, and control, it seems to follow that those best kept secrets would hide the greatest vulnerabilities. The reality is, when we find the strategies and tools that may actually upset or revolutionize the world, we will know because our leaders will be afraid. This is why we see such strong responses to terrorism. The government wants us to write bills and sign petitions. Permissive individualism can do nothing but hold us back in this moment of institutional oppression. Quote, the great philosophical question, why is there something rather than nothing, and quote, must now be read in reverse, quote, why is there nothing rather than something? That was Baudrillard. It is almost incomprehensible to conduct an analysis characterized by a search for what isn't there. But this concern misunderstands the nature of the frame. It is not lack, which hides the non-existence of the missing signifier and, quote, ceases to be the object, and, quote, McGowan, once it is obtained. It cannot be because absence is incomplete. It is the whole that is left behind when something that was once there is removed. It holds its shape. What is present is the desperate move to fill or cover this empty space. And for this reason, absence is not the dialectical opposite of presence, and the path between them cannot be characterized by reversal. Instead, presence reflects absence. They must, to be able to offer an explanation for the same set of material conditions, because something must be present to serve as an explanation for these effects. So the search for absence must begin with what is present to analyze its shape and look for the crumbling, inconsistent edges. But without the guiding organization of linear opposition, the path between these points evades location or mapping. And the point is not location or direction. We do not travel along vectors. Instead, the road from what is present to what is absent is characterized by our collective refusal. We should take comfort in knowing that we are exactly where we were never, ever supposed to be, because that is where our power to resist is hidden.
And speaking of things that we're not supposed to be doing and places that we're not supposed to be, we need to head back to the subtle conceptual distinction between the internet and an internet. In general, we perceive the internet, capital D, capital I, in terms of the liminal space that we mentioned earlier, which is sort of a free-flowingly commiserating rhizome of information ideology, as it were. However, the internet is only a section of the internet. The much larger sections being the deep web, the vast majority of which is uncategorized information, and the dark web, which it's helpful to make this distinction to characterize what we perceive to be the internet, just to be an internet among others, to remind ourselves that the liminality we perceive on Instagram, Twitter, Google, etc., is only a simulation as such. For our particular analysis, we're focusing primarily on the dark web internet. The primary difference here is the way information is transferred on the dark web through a process called onion routing. There's a little diagram there. Instead of having a piece of information simply travel between 2 points, like a transmitter and a receiver, onion routing uses a kind of multiple encryption whose layers of encryption are peeled back successively as it passes randomly through nodes and intermediary servers. Each of these de-encryption nodes is programmed such that they can only analyze which node the information is traveling to and which one it's coming from, which means that no single analyzable point of information flow can give both the source and destination of this information. It's not a completely invulnerable method of information transfer, but it is incomparably safer and overall strictly better than the internet that we use in terms of organizing our activisms. So how can it organize our activisms? Well, the dark web offers a highly preferable alternative to our disillusioned online activist. The dark web can mobilize potentially insurrectionary activities in the world while also being a site of such activities. Horizontally organized and decentralized resistance, let's take for a poor taste example, ISIL and the Taliban, succeed because they are decentralized. While an arborescent state of capture, such as the United States, fights well when it has a head to cut off, terrorism is uniquely advantaged because there is no one head that will disfigure the whole. The dark web, if it were to be used by radical anti-capitalists, would add an additional layer of protection against an outside force in terms of accessibility of organizing and general mobilization. If anything, the dark web has a very robust community of users who 3D print firearms, which is highly illegal, which seems to lend a little credence to this notion. However, the dark web itself can also be used to insurrectionary ends. One example of this, I probably should have put a visual or something for this, is the IoT botnet, IoT standing for Internet of Things. IoT devices are tech that is connected to the internet in some way, shape, or form. As detailed in Hacker Quarterly, Volume 35, Issue 3, IoT devices can be compromised over the dark web. By scanning a particular network, our activists can find susceptible IoT devices and begin a brute forcing password cracking attempt, which will either generate passwords iteratively or reference them from a list. Most IoT device passwords are either the defaults or generally weak, so this really isn't much of a problem. Following this, the activist can install different firmware on an IoT device, which is essentially bringing it under their control. These compromised IoT devices can be used as springboards into other IoT devices as well, which gives room for a large network to develop. They can also follow a decentralized command structure, such that the devices take commands from other compromised devices, which would obscure the source of these commands. A compromised device is capable of DDoS, which is a denial of service through heavy traffic flooding attacks, and PDoS, which is a permanent denial of service or complete and irreparable software malfunction. All of this is only really scratching the surface of what an IoT botnet is capable of, and more broadly speaking, of what the dark web is capable of in terms of cyber insurgency. So, how can all of this help our activists directly attack these structures of power that they seek to disassemble, or even capital as a whole? Well, in our neoliberal age, capital is essentially metastasized. In order to make more efficient the processes of government and business, the internet became an essential tool in many of these structures. In our internet epoch, almost everything is mediated by or tangential to in the internet in some way. To jump to our conclusion, the extreme accessibility of the internet and the proliferation of its proliferation in the business sector has handed a sometimes literal gun to almost anybody who can reach for one. In that same issue of Hacker Quarterly I mentioned earlier, user Brad, with an @ for the A, outlines several free and legal resources online for people who have an interest in this sort of thing. Usually in the form of games, these websites can provide simple instructions and hours of practice to anybody with an interest in this sort of thing. Back to the gun metaphor though, the dark web's onion routing also seems to provide a perfect shooting range with no wind. To echo the invisible committee, as for methods, let's adopt the following principle from sabotage: a minimum risk in taking the action, a minimum of time, and maximum damage. The end pursued by this omnipresent war of attrition is, if you can go back to the end that we want to be pursued by this omnipresent war of attrition is IMDAC, which is our cute little abbreviation for immediate mandatory decentralized anarcho-communism. The near inseparability of capitalism and the internet in the West could potentially facilitate the destruction of capital. Should it take the scale that we're talking about, it is well within reason to imagine the complex networking of capital along commodity frontiers and mediated by the internet could be shifted irreparably past capitalism and the state into anarcho-communism. Obviously, we're not really the first to advocate this outcome, but our focus centers on reaching this stage. We tend to follow the Invisible Committee's prescription of the development of communes through networks of mutual aid to blunt this abrupt shift. And following Marx's line of reasoning in the first section of the German ideology, The recent expansion of mutual aid networks is indicative of an imminent epochal shift relating to the means of subsistence and production. So, in short, we believe that the internet and the dark web specifically has the potential to play a significant role in this shift. And that's Chairless Liminalities. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. Catherine and Sam. Again, a wonderful presentation and much to discuss. So I won't be taking up much time. I would want to open the floor to discussions from all the participants and the audience. And it's so good to see people from the other panel joining in. So thank you so much for attending the session, Shubhendu. And this is also an invitation for others. If your time zone permits, I know that's not the best game to be in the other panel, which is 1:40 p.m. CST. So please join as an attendee if you can, because we will be having continuing discussions on liminalities and such interesting papers. So just to quickly kind of have my 2 cents on this. What I have been constantly looking at, probably as a scholar of comparative literature, doing my job of kind of connecting them through threads that I could see. All these papers kind of got me thinking about the nature of the liminal space. What is the nature of the liminal space that we are all talking about? Holly and Catherine, Sam's paper kind of, I'm sorry, Rohini and Catherine and Sam's paper looks at the relationship between the state and the body and the legal political system, the body politic itself. Whereas Holly is technically looking at an interpersonal relationship, especially body and mind, both being present. However, it makes me think further whether that also goes beyond the interpersonal relationship of the self and the other self, and also goes on to extend to the macrocosm of the state and subjectivity as well. And the way I see all of your works connecting is this. I mean, the whole idea that kind of started with Holly's paper about the affective membrane being the liminal space, the patch. I love the use of the word patch that you kind of made in your presentation about how it becomes an escape route, or rather an escape patch, as you put it. And then moving on to Rohini's discussion around the Indigenous women's bodies as being the patch, probably, which can be also looked at as an oasis in terms of the severity of the murdered and missing Indigenous women's accounts and the long history of exploitation that has been going on, that has been very intentionally put under the carpet by the government for ages now, under the garb of multiculturalism and promises of a better Canada. To Catherine and Sam's discussion around how we are looking at the dark web and probably the whole discussion around the internet and an internet, how we have always visualized the internet as this web space, and which makes me question whether that liminal space, or as a border studies scholar, whether the intersections in a web talk about one border. Is it one form of border that we're thinking about? Or is it an intersection of multiple borders that again also reflects on Rohini and Holly's works in terms of What are the parameters on which the bodies are lying? Where is this liminal space that we are kind of locating each of our subjects and texts on? Are the protesters who kind of stormed the Capitol Hill, the Capitol, can they be called protesters? I remember there was a huge discussion regarding whether they can be called protesters. How do we use the word protester? What does it mean? What kind of political, ethical meaning does it hold? Yes. To kind of Rohini's example of the Indigenous woman, and one of the many examples, I'm pretty sure Rohini will back me up on that. One of the many accounts that we don't even know about in terms of where their bodies lie. What is that one whole trail that has been called the trail of murdered and missing Indigenous women? Very literally a liminal space where women trying to walk are abducted, raped, and they go missing, which is the worst. We don't know where those bodies are suspended. And also kind of coming to Holly's work, which made me think about questions of pain and kind of embodiment of pain on the body, as you talked about the gunshot. That made me think about questions of surveillance and modulations of pain. What happens when that affective membrane becomes or might become a membrane of violence or exploitation? What happens if something like rape, which is again a very bodily and psychological feeling, can also be translated through that jacket that that person is wearing? Where does that put that subject? So we have many thoughts. These are like some of the initial knots that I wanted to untie and lay out on the table. So with that, I would love to open the floor to anybody who would want to respond to any of that, who would want to ask a question. Please take it from here. And I would just turn the whole discussion thing to, and maybe we can like kind of go a little towards the screen, if that's okay with everyone. Or I think if I just like put the laptop here, right? Like we all can kind of, Polo, maybe, but not really far away, because we also want the other panelists to hear us. Yeah. And I want.
Yeah, we're chilling. What is the curses?
We can be in. Yeah, because I want them to be. Yeah. Can you all hear us if we are talking a little loudly? Okay. I think my. Yeah.
So you have to turn. Everybody has to turn. Yes.
Yes, and it's before that. Okay. So, can everybody hear me? I think they can. Okay. So if anyone has a question, please go ahead and ask, or any comments or feedback or review, we welcome all of that. If you want to respond to any of the initial thoughts.
I'll take it if that's okay. I was going to build on your point, actually. I have a question for Catherine and Sam. You were talking about the connections between our research, and this is one of the things that I think we're all probably on a similar wavelength here, thinking about the connections between our particular projects. But what struck me was your, especially the Black Lives Matter example of sharing the black squares and this sort of social media activism. And one of the things that I'm talking about with this membrane is the fact that we can switch off and just step away, and we're no longer experiencing these affects or emotions. Do you think that that has an impact on people's social media activism? And do you think that that's people can share a square, but as soon as they put the phone down, they've removed themselves from that situation and from those conversations? Do you think that that has any effect on why people are tending towards social media for these forms of activism and their lack of, or the extent of their effectiveness?
I can start if you want to like.
Yeah, sure.
Bounce
You can
down.
hear us all right, right? Like we're good from over here?
Awesome.
All right, cool.
Yeah, at least from my perspective, I think that the, sorry, one of the major effects of that is the distance that the online activist is able to generate from like the problems that they're facing. And so like within that distance, there's like a sense of like, this is the wrong time to pull in charity cannibalism, but that is what I'm thinking of, is that like the issues no longer feel real. It's easier to disconnect from them. And so the idea that you might be kind of commodifying and profiting off of them, but never truly engaging with them or materially affecting them is no longer as big of an issue. Because once you're able to turn your screen off, because that problem is not something that is materially affecting you, you don't ever have to think about it again. And so it becomes like psychologically viable to engage for a moment and then never revisit the issue.
And that's also like, it's also like, it's so easy to fall into that too, especially in the age of like information overload that we live in and just complete overstimulation in every turn. Like it's not really like, that's the impulse. It's like, it's so easy to just throw your hand up and say like, what else can I do here? You know, like I've done what I can, this is stressing me out, like I'm over with it, you know?
Yeah. That reminds me of a very like specific quote. Am I being loud enough? Do you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm gonna take that as yes. But I don't know, Kate's comment about charity cannibalism really reminded me of this very specific Baudrillard quote, I believe, in his essay, No Pity for Sarajevo, who describes how like this kind of violence gets laundered like dirty money on like intellectual marketplaces. And it seems to me that like there's this kind of like sentimental attachment people have to some of the violence where they can like just, engage with it on the level of like the internet or on social media, and then can completely detach themselves from it when they like can step away from that. And it's kind of like feel-good politics, like you feel like you're changing something. You feel like you're fighting the good fight. You're helping ending systemic racism. You're helping stop like Jeff Bezos from destroying the environment by like launching up into space. But like you never go out and do anything with that like anger you have about these situations, because you're able to vent it on these digital like marketplaces, on Twitter.
But they also be, oh, sorry.
Oh, go for it.
I was just going to say, they also become part of your brand then, right? If we've shared this black square on our Instagram, we've shown who we are, what we believe in, what our ethos is, in a very marketable way, which, especially as Sam was bringing in neoliberalism here, I think is really important.
Absolutely. And I think you can't see the paper because we're reading it. But when we say the good activist, we have a capital G and a capital A. And that's why, because it's all part of the virtual kind of image that you create of yourself, the sign value you can generate for that image. And that's one of the moments in which politics online becomes virtue signaling and performative activism. I wanted to ask about the paper on Indigenous women in Canada. Because I was thinking about that in the context of like kind of the information economy and the kinds of information we are or are not given access to, like seems in a lot is often like very particular, like to achieve a specific goal on the part of power. And I was wondering if Rohini, if you had any thoughts about like the way that the media has been used either to facilitate the forgetting, or generally to facilitate the forgetting of these women.
I just couldn't catch the last bit. My internet is not always very trustworthy, so if you could just maybe type in a sentence.
Yeah,
I think I would just like, that would be better. It's just getting disconnected in the.
While Catherine is typing her question, oh, okay, you can. Yeah, I can. Rohini, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Now I can hear you.
Yeah, I think the connection is a bit wobbly on either our side.
It's my internet, like it.
Yeah, I think, okay, so Catherine has a question. I think just to what her question is, talking about the possibilities of using the liminal space, how do you think this space can be used to facilitate or subvert, like how do you see the space working as a way of bringing back the histories of these forgotten women, or even channelizing their resistance?
Okay. Thank you for the questions. I'll just okay, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the ways media and information economy have been used to facilitate the suggesting of interest. Well, this is a very interesting question you have like asked Catherine, because the role of media and information has always been a point of focus, as Ragini would probably back me up on this. Like we both majored in Indigenous studies during our post-graduation days. So this, the use of media and information has always been a questionable thing. Has been used to facilitate the forgetting of the Indigenous women. Obviously, it has been used as I said right in the beginning of my paper, when I was searching, I was looking for mainstream media like newspapers with that spoke and addressed the issue of the Indigenous women, of the murdered and the missing Indigenous women. I was absolutely, like I said, I was so amazed to see that there is so little that has been spoken about. But since like I have been researching on this for a very long time, I do keep in touch with the news, like in the other, you know, alternative media and everything. It has been a very crippling problem. But the point is just to maintain the very good role model kind of structure of Canada. The mainstream media, the information that often reaches us is really, it is doctored, it is half-hearted. Like not much of the information reaches us. So yeah, it is like it does, like add to the process of forgetting the problems and the issues that the Indigenous communities face, as well as women. Now here, like I'm talking about double marginalization, I would like to mention the issue of Indian residential schools, something which I'm working on, right? So like the issues, the news that are coming up right now, all these have been discussed much earlier by Indigenous authors like Richard Wagamese, then Lee Maricel, then Janice Armstrong. All these issues have been discussed. The issue of unmasked graves. I was reading a book by Richard Wagamese, Indian Horse. I found the mention of unmasked graves in a 2012 book. Okay, so it has been in the news, it has been in the print, it has been in the media for such a long time. But it is so sad that the mainstream media, which has the power to change the course, the discourse of a nation, only is bringing it up when there is no other way to hide the issue. So obviously, media plays a
I hope we can have it back.
Yeah. Maybe we can take some other questions while she reconnects.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
I have a comment. Probably it's also tied to a question as well. So I was really fascinated by all the papers, very perceptive and passionately argued, but especially intrigued by Holly's kind of idea of affective membranes, because I work on the kind of intersection of medical humanities and Victorian studies. So there is a book called Membrane by Laura Otis, which talks about how when the idea of membrane came in itself in cell theory, there was a lot of discussion about what is the border of the human, where the human ends and the environment begins, or where is the end between the healthy cell and the pathogenic kind of environment. So I was thinking with this kind of digital configuration of membrane as well, whether the human kind of bordered, securely kind of encapsulated human has only been a very recent invention, and which is going to be kind of gone very soon with the digital affective selfhood and its own kind of permeability. And that also leads me to I have a question for Catherine and Sam as well, for their really kind of passionately argued and great paper. And I was thinking whether all these activists who are trapped in their political echo chambers, and they're kind of flashing their brand of the good activist, which is a really interesting idea. Whether they are also kind of trapped in some kind of affective chamber to bring something from Holly, whether they feel really good by simply kind of retweeting things or kind of branding them in specific ways on Twitter, and whether that affective investment kind of substitutes real political organization and so on, which also requires its own kind of effective engagement, of course.
Holly, if you want to answer first, definitely.
Okay. So yeah, I think one of the key things that I want to get across is the fact that this is still very much a negotiation. I don't have an answer for where the body begins and ends and where feeling begins and ends with technology. And also, I think it's changing at such a rapid rate. When I started researching this, already now you see people, the smartwatches, I think are a huge shift in this, because it's something that's physically on your wrist that pings and vibrates, and you have this sensation that's part of your body at all times. Whereas at least with a phone, if it's in your hand or it's not in your hand, there's a difference between the relationship with something that's strapped to your wrist. But I think then that in terms of emotions and where it begins and ends, as I say, I do think it's still shifting, but I think that, and relating back to Catherine and Sam's work as well, that I think it's, oh, can you not hear me? No.
I can hear you.
Sorry. I don't know if it was cut off then. So yeah, sorry. Hopefully you managed to catch most of that. But what I was going to say in connection to Catherine and Sam's work as well, that I think it's really important of our ability to compartmentalize relationships and feelings, and that we do this at a lot of points in our lives now. Most of us have multiple Instagrams in order to compartmentalize our lives and say, this is my private personal Instagram, which means that this one's emotionally invested, whereas this professional one isn't. And again, going back to neoliberalism, we're making ourselves more efficient, making ourselves, this streamlined product. And I think that it would be interesting to me as well to know, when people were sharing the black squares, were they sharing them on private Instagrams or their public professional ones? I can't hear anyone, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, we're trying to make sure not to, oh. Awesome. Okay, wait. Can I get a thumbs up? Awesome. Yes, we're winning. We're beating the virtual. So I think that, again, I started writing down it's like notes and stuff, so I'm just gonna. I think the answer that I was thinking of to the question for Holly kind of ties into my answer to our question, because when I was thinking about where the human starts and ends, I've read a lot of like queer inhumanism or Deleuzian inhumanism. So the idea that we're all like kind of foundationally like forces and flows and affects and like movement, and that is like almost like in a sense that Barab describes like a universal substance like quarks. And I think that's interesting because I think that changes, or like I hesitate to say is problematized by, because I don't know that a problem is the right way to describe it, but certainly the question of relationality and affective connection is like has to shift a little bit once we start thinking about technology that generates like physical or emotional sensations. And so in that way, I feel like yes, the good activist definitely I feel is trapped in a kind of affective chamber. But I think that the way that I've understood this, at least for myself, is in terms of like the colonization of the political imaginary, that like we're only allowed to ask particular questions and generate certain responses. And so in Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari's site, Levi Strauss, and his discussion of bricolage, and it's the idea that we have like a set of instruments or ideas that we know, things that we understand about the world and relations and strategies and organizing, and those things are supposed to be kind of in flux. We have a set number of things that we have access to that they can be moved around and paired in different ways. And I think that the way that this affective echo chamber has operated is to render these instruments static.
so that we can only understand how they apply to a particular thing or relate to each other in particular ways. And I think that the role of a liminal space would be to allow us to kind of render those instruments in flux and understand like our affective capacities, relational capacities in ways that have not been overdetermined by power structures. And I think that kind of gets to the root of when I say, like, when we find the things that will actually allow us to resist, our leaders will be afraid because we will be asking the questions that we're not supposed to ask, is that like, when we are able to kind of follow our lines of flight and our affect in ways that were not predetermined or prescripted, we'll have found like our real revolutionary capacities. I don't know if either of you had anything you wanted to add to that.
I think you said that pretty succinctly.
Yeah, I think you covered it.
Thanks.
I actually had a question for Holly. So I found that your paper to be very like pertinent given the recent like shift that Facebook has been doing to like be metaverse and the way that they are trying to create a very similar sense to how I remember when I saw Ready Player One, very similar kind of simulated reality where we can interact with one another. And this also ties into a question I believe that Ragini asked earlier, if I have this written down somewhere, like what happens if our like affective membrane is used in exploitation? And well, like in the time I've been like spending in Vegas, the kind of like hyper neurostimulation that we get from just like experience all the lights, all the ways that we're constantly told to like focus in. You think about like slot machines, how it's constantly trying to keep you awake and participate, interact, and things that generate forms of like revenue. So in the light of like, I read a lot of the work of this town philosopher Franco Berardi, we cited them in the paper, in his newest book that came out like a month ago or something. He discussed how there's a very like limit to the kind of capacities of the body to be able to like undergo this kind of stimulation. So I was wondering like one, like what you thought about this kind of development of metaverses. It seems to be a very like real world example of like Ready Player One unfolding, and as well if you think that like affective membrane is a way of like bridging that like capacity the body has for the stimulation. Like when you think like an affective membrane kind of to me makes me think of like Elon Musk's neural net, how you can directly like link into it our brains into the computer and kind of experience that way. So yeah, I guess like what do you think about metaverse, and do you think like the affective membrane is like way of overcoming that limit of the body to experience this kind of stimulation?
Sorry to interrupt. I mean, I was just absolutely loving this discussion, but we have another panel waiting outside, and I think we need to.
If you are willing to hang out for a little bit longer, we could quickly go down to the lobby and just like have our discussion, but we have to leave the room. Because, so I hate to kind of like and stop this discussion.
Absolutely sorry to interrupt.
You started asking questions.
And even like tying in what you were anyway discussing to Rohini's question about media, I was just thinking about how algorithm works and what circulates. So circulation of text and hashtags. Murdered and missing Indigenous women. I think she kind of cut off while she was probably going to come to that point about how circulation is so important in terms of humanities and circulation of texts, right? Like what are texts? How are texts located in liminal spaces? Oh my God, I hate this. I hate to stop this discussion.
Yeah, can we join Zoom after?
If people are up for it, like we can quickly move to like the lobby and continue for like 10 more minutes if people are up for it. If you're it's already night in your part of the world and you have to go, we totally understand that as well. So what do you think? What would people vote for?
I want to keep talking.
Yeah, I want to.
It's 9 a.m. here, so we're definitely.
Can quickly back and leave the room.
Just like occupy them.
Oh my God, so you're in silence.
I'm guessing that people want to hang around for 10 more minutes. Is that what everybody's up for?
I really, if nothing else, I'll definitely email my questions.
Okay, then we will just quickly move to the law.
I think we can just make this work.
We also see this other very,
Okay, I'm not coming on, so
okay.
you guys can actually get a live streaming of how we are moving.
Has it been a good conference? Obviously, we're not, with being on the other side of the world, I'm missing it. The
conference is
atmosphere.
going, I'm so sorry that we all couldn't be here together. It would have been much better had this been in person, I think. Oh, we found a new room. Yay.
Continue the discussion.
Yes.
Guys, we just got a room, so just wanted to let you know.
I know, I love it. The things academics do. Just for the sake of a good conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see you. And we can all let
Yeah.
You're
Gonna finish.
Yeah, we can just like sit around, right? Like this table is wonderful. All right, guys, just give us a minute. Okay. Sounds.
There we go. All right. There's 3 technologies here now. Yeah. Oh yeah, look at that. So you did the question last, yeah, you should probably sit closest to it.
Yeah. Yes.
I think
Yeah. All right. Okay.
Yeah, I just felt like static.
I know, I think it's.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
actually
It
wasn't
should have been like
how,
this.
right?
You know, we did it.
Yeah. So I think we were waiting for Holly's response to a question.
Okay, so it had cut out a little bit, so I'm sorry. I hope I've heard enough of it to grasp what you were asking. I think firstly, I find it fascinating, this idea of the brain and technology as an extension of the brain. I think if we're talking about it as an extension of the body, then it makes perfect sense to think about it as an extension of our emotions and our capacity for feeling. What I find particularly interesting with Wade is we have this sense of overstimulated numbness now, where we're constantly given information, mostly through technology, and we are constantly stimulated in multiple ways, and that's producing this sort of systemic numbness and our inability to experience emotions. And I think for Wade, he then uses technology as a way in. He is unable, he has this, great sense of depression and this disillusionment with his everyday life. And I know that he's living in poor economic conditions in the novel, but he's using that as a way to access relationships, to build friendships, to experience pleasure when he's using the fleshlights and the virtual brothels. And these are things that he is unable to experience. So I don't know necessarily whether that's a cognitive thing for him, whether it's an extension of his brain, but if we talk about it as an extension of his body, I think he's still trying to, in the novel, he comes to terms with the fact that he's still alone, and yet he's experiencing friendships online. I think it's something that he's perhaps not necessarily comfortable with. And I think a lot of us are still trying to grapple with that as well in everyday lives. I'm having a great conversation with you online, for instance, but I'm still trying to navigate the fact that this isn't me sat in a room having a chat with you and then we're going to go to the pub after. There's a difference in that kind of relationship and the kind of relationships you're able to build through technology. When we talk about haptic technology, again, I think that that's something you have to, it's whether you accept that in your mind, that that's an extension of your body or something external to it. And when he's using this fleshlight, he's not assuming that's another body. He's assuming that that's a fleshlight. So to him, I don't think that's an extension, or, I mean, that might be a bad example because it would be another person rather than himself. But even if
that might be my laptop again. The Wi-Fi. Oh no, now it seems like
Yeah,
right?
I think everyone else is okay, right? We're all, the rest of us are
Hopefully we
here.
get Holly back.
If Rohini wants to jump in though.
Yeah, and finish especially about the algorithm and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm so sorry for that interruption. That's a very common thing when I'm presenting online, so it's okay. So, Catherine, could I answer your question? Could I address what you asked? So as I was telling, for me, understanding the role of media has been really important, and it has been a recurring problem because there's this constant, suppressing of letting the indigenous I deal with literature, so letting indigenous literature come out, be a mainstream thing, right? The indigenous people of Canada, they do not want to identify themselves as the marginalized. Like if you interact with them and maybe mention the term of their literature being marginalized, they are not okay with it. They want their literature to be termed as mainstream, but the problem is getting getting that exposure is still a very questionable thing. Like as I was saying, when I started working on the Indian residential school system, I probably had read a poem or two on it. There was nothing else that I could access. Like this has been a real challenge for my research. And then the pandemic started and I was left with just a few YouTube 10 minutes, 20 minutes documentaries. That's what I was left with. Funnily enough, I could locate a movie. The name of the movie is Older Than America. Like my instinct tells me the reason I found it so easily on YouTube because Bradley Cooper features in a very important role. It is a movie directed by an Indigenous director, but I think there are many movies like this, but I couldn't find any of those. The one I could find was the one which featured Bradley Cooper. So you understand what's happening there. So finding the role of media has been really, really political when I started studying about the Indigenous Canadian system, and I think it's very similar for any Indigenous community all over the world. They are kept as they are kept in a liminal place, and they are not space, and they are not allowed to escape rise from that marginalization and make their presence as a mainstream entity. Okay, this, and to answer your question, Polomi, about subverting liminal spaces, I think the only way, I read a very interesting thing, I think it was a Lee Maracle poem or someone's poem, I don't remember exactly. The poem was the title of the poem was performance or performing, something like this. What the poem does is, the poet over there deconstructs the English language, yet keeps words in such a way that an English speaker would clearly understand it. So I think a very good way to subvert a liminal space is to use the tools that have been used to create that liminal space by the ones in the power position, and kind of use it as a boomerang and return it to them and see how it works. I think that is probably a very, very effective way, because I found that poem, I'm really bad at remembering. I read it some 4 years ago, but I remember the way the English language was deconstructed over there. It was such an intelligent move. It was a very, very hard slap on the faces of the colonizers, but but the information which the indigenous poet wanted to transfer to the ones reading, to the colonizers, was clearly, transferred. But there was elements of indigeneity within that. So I think that's a good way to, try and subvert liminal spaces. Again, I am telling, I am not indigenous, so maybe the person, maybe I don't know if I'm qualified enough to make such comments, but I think that is one way to, combat the liminal space. If I could answer your questions, if I made any sense, that is.
That, oh, sorry. No, you're totally good. Wait, did you?
I'm just,
Oh, okay. No, that made a lot of sense. Actually, that reminded me really strongly of something I was reading while we were getting our presentation ready. Moten and Harney released, yeah. Well, I forget what the book is called.
It's the new one?
Yeah.
The new book is called All Incomplete.
All
It came out in
Incomplete.
2021.
Yeah, thank you. But there was a section at I don't remember which chapter it was in. You'll remember. As soon as I start explaining what I'm talking about, you'll be able to tell me what page it was on. But there's a lot of quotations that are like written in regional dialects, and they are, I think this is important.
The mic though.
Yes.
It's like chapter 1 or 2 or something.
Yeah, of course.
It's chapter 1.
You would know. So the way that they like kind of analyze this is that the use of language is like policed and like overdetermined and like a colonization of the political imaginary, right? And that like this kind of language isn't like acceptable or professional. And this is one of the reasons that they talk about like why there's so much code switching between like home spaces and like professional spaces. But that like this is because like the kind of non-standardized language, even though like we are all pretty much able to understand it, is like somehow less effective or efficient or productive. And for me as like a linguistics major, I think there are like two things. The first thing this reminds me of is our like linguistic accident when we ended up with an internet, and like the ways that like we don't even realize a lot of times like that the words that we use, the ways that our sentences are constructed, come so much from like just the semiotics that were involved in our upbringing and our learning of language. And then, and I'm going to kick myself for this, I read far too much Deleuze to be talking about Lacan right now. But the idea that the subconscious is structured, or the unconscious is structured like a language, like that's the only framework we have for accessing reality, is like that, like, and so our political imaginary is completely linguistic. And so I think that deconstructing the English language, or whichever language it is that we are constructing our beliefs and ideologies in, is an incredible first place to start, because that's kind of the only way we can unhinge our like traditional kind of constructions and meanings and affects, and allow ourselves to kind of restructure our thoughts and relations.
If I could add on, so in that chapter from All Incomplete, there's like a very pertinent example I remember. I think it discusses, I think the person's name was Mike, which is why the chapter is like Mike the Rebellator, and how they're jaywalking across the street, but it's not just like jaywalking across the street, but also linguistically, like the use of dialects and way of throwing a kink into the neat and ordered flows of like as you would think on like transit or travel in terms of a street, but also like discourse as well. And that kind of makes me think of what Rohini said about like how we can, use these, we can throw these systems back at them at like a boomerang, creating these kinks or knots in them, so it doesn't like work as smoothly as they want, and create these kind of inefficiencies, or just operate for what makes life meaningful to us against what they is best for their productive capacities.
Representation is a general point of violence.
Yeah.
I was just going to add as well. It had. Sorry, was I talking over you, Sam?
No, Stan was just throwing out
I was going to say, I think the thing to remember as well is it is still politically loaded when people are, and we're talking about how it can dismantle certain ideologies by using regional dialects. But there was this, so I don't know if you know much about BBC newsreaders, but the BBC would always have RP accents. You had to have an RP accent to be on the telly. And in the last couple of decades, we've seen this increase in BBC news presenters with accents and dialects and this more regional sense of news. But what happens is the news itself doesn't change. We just feel that they are more accessible and more relatable and more honest because we recognise. So I'm from Yorkshire, and people say that a Yorkshire accent is associated with honesty and is trustworthiness. So if you send a certain message with someone with a Yorkshire accent, it doesn't change what the message is. It just means it's received differently.
I just want to appreciate the fact that I see that the trajectory of the conversations going from where is the liminal space taking us, from deciding the direction of where are we going with this to how do we combat and dismantle these power structures that exist, or how to rework the liminal space in our stride instead of just protesting unnecessarily or without much results. So that was one comment I was just thinking all over this, all the while we were like walking around and finding a room. So I cannot just appreciate this enough. And I think both Ragini and I are like we've. This is our heartfelt gratitude to all of you to that you made this work. This was the first time that we are co-chairing or doing any kind of like chairing work in any conference. So I just want to appreciate all of you for that. So big cheers.
And conversations ranging from Canadian Indigenous studies to Holly's work on a completely Cyborgian
eclecticism,
yes, right? Like
post-humanism
to
digital humanity,
to political discussions around virtual reality and social media. I mean, and again, like what they were kind of responding to right now. I was just thinking about how am I audible to you guys?
Oh
Yeah.
no. Oh, she's gone.
Oh, Holly.
I think hopefully she will come. Well, her internet cut out, so we'll see if she comes back.
Yeah. I was just going on.
I am there. I can hear you.
You are here. Finally, you're here.
I can hear.
Either Rohini or Holly, like pick your.
Otherwise there's no point.
I mean, there will be probably a little bit, in some little bit time, it will be probably like a hologram of Holly.
Oh my God,
projected here.
Silicon Valley has that. I was thinking about that a lot.
Yeah, with Coldplay and BTS's new production of My Universe, that's become like too real. We have all of that, like cyborgs, aliens, music. I think it presents our panel. It literally presents our panel.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if Holly is going to be back soon, but I mean, what I wanted to kind of just kind of come back to was the idea of these liminal spaces. And as we were talking about subversion, Bolame, which is very important in terms of being post-colonial scholars, both of us, I know Rohini as well. The way kind of people like Sarah Ahmed and then Pava and they have talked about these spaces as hybrid spaces, these spaces where it is a confluence of cultures is happening. It's a space of mixing, right? So however you want to define that confluence. And I was just thinking about that meme that was not a meme, like a post that was circulated very recently. If you have the mic, just pass it on. And that made me think so much about privilege and who has voice, and why should we stop representing and actually start passing on the mic and let the people speak who needs to speak up, right? I mean, and again, like going back to what I was kind of talking about at that point, in terms of circulation, what makes it possible for videos to circulate, for posts to circulate, right? And what is taken off YouTube, and why is it taken off YouTube, right? And all these aspects that comprise the liminal space, that forms the liminal space, and Holly's wonderful presentation as well, in terms of care, right? Like her paper made me think a lot about healthcare. Though if we are using a video gaming structure to forget depression as we hit login, right? We are escaping from the reality. Why do we need to escape in the first place? Where is healthcare that is going to help me combat depression, provide me medicine, help me get therapy, and or probably in a lot of ways, provide me with support that won't
let depression come to me in a lot of cases. I'm not trying to reduce depression to, non-availability of work or things like that. But in a lot of cases, that is, right? That is the case. That leads to cases of depression, right? So how forms of healthcare, state care, care as provided by institutions are suspended in these liminal spaces. And I think that ties in what Rohini was kind of saying right now as well, right? Like in terms of how the pandemic situation was dealt with in all these liminal spaces. And again, like coming back to your presentation, if we are looking at the dark web, how is it being used? And if we are talking about subversion, let's remember that the dark web is also legalized, right? Let's not forget that. It is also under surveillance. It is also legalized, right? It is because it is allowed to exist. It exists, right? And moments when forms of institutions, forms of power structures would want to capitalize the dark web, they can do it, right? So you allow the other to exist only in order for the self to kind of reinstate its position of power even more, right?
That reminds me very much about like Jean Baudrillard's discussion of otherness, because for him it's like the other has to be integrated into a system of difference where they can be categorized as like, oh, here are the ways in which we are distinct, is the kind of way of marking the body or making the body signifies that way. It can be easily coded or made differentiable, whereas like he'll have these discussions of like radical otherness, or where it's just there's a complete foreignness, and that's what he thinks like we should have as a relation.
Exactly.
So that really
Exactly.
think of that.
If I don't know if you have already read up, if you haven't, I would definitely recommend this reading to the three of you. Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer.
I've heard of it. I have not yet gotten
Yes,
around to
you
it.
should absolutely read that.
It's always on someone's bookshelf. I have so many books I've never read that are just sitting there right
So many of
there.
them there.
It's a phenomenal book, and it's the good thing about Homo Sacer is it's not too long. So
Yeah, it's like a fat
very
essay. That's it. Like
concise, very precise, very crispy words, very spiriting there.
which kind of like, I mean, the reason I kind of mentioned that is because what we are talking about right now, in terms of even what Rohini was kind of pointing at while presenting her paper, that how all these things are not recognized. Books are not allowed to be published. And then there is one fine day when you have the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in all sweet words saying things like, oh, we are going to do these events for celebrate the Orange Day, right? Remember all the children who have been killed and murdered, and we are sorry for what has happened. Like, I'm the first Prime Minister who is apologizing for all these incidents, right? So the state intervenes in order to position itself as this caregiver, rescuer, sort of, the person, the kind of institution that is there to actually,
itself,
yes, right? And like actually kind of, I want to say, kind of reaffirm your position in the society as well, right?
Funnily enough, Ragini, I'd like just add one point, just when you mentioned about Justin Trudeau apologizing and everything. So I was reading another book. The book is titled Magic Weapons. So it's a beautiful book. Okay, I don't remember the author exactly. It's a book on a few group of indigenous people who went out on a mission, I think, to collect pieces. So I don't exactly remember the book, but it's a very beautiful book. So there it was mentioned that the idea of reconciliation, which the Canadian government is, cashing on and saying that we're apologizing for incidents like the Indian residential school system and everything, that kind of that idea of reconciliation doesn't exist within the indigenous communities. That whole idea of reconciliation, that apology, because what happens is the lives that were lost, because it's very important for the indigenous communities. Like I'm talking in respect to the ones who ones who didn't survive, the ones who died. It's very important for the indigenous communities to pay them proper respect, so that within their culture, so that their spirit is free and everything. It's a norm within their cultures. But the point is, with the unmarked graves, with the children who did not come back, or the women who were raped and killed and thrown in the river, their bodies were not found, maybe a boot or maybe some pieces of clothes were found, reconciliation never happened for them. Reconciliation for them is not a physical concept, it's more of a spiritual concept, which the Canadian government, and I feel any capitalist government, can't really recognize. So like I would add to Ragini's point over there. So that just reminded me of that. So yeah, that.
To that, again, we are kind of not piling up is the wrong word, but kind of just to add to the conversation. There's this one, I'm not an Indigenous literature scholar, but I love reading their works. And one of the new works that I have been introduced to while staying in Minnesota is by Lady Long Soldier. She's a Dakotan author, and she has a beautiful collection of poems and writings, which is I would absolutely recommend all of you to read. It's called Where and there, something very similar happened to what Trudeau did in Canada. The U.S. ex-president Obama wanted to apologize to the Dakotan community for the slaughter and like rampant, reclaiming indigenous lands and kind of shifting them and pushing them back into the margins of the Dakota. Now all they have are like these small lands. They still don't have property rights. They don't have ownership rights. They don't have proper healthcare access. And that became more visible during the pandemic when they couldn't get access to healthcare, to the vaccine, to getting vaccinated as soon as possible. So I think these conversations are very, very important. That where are these communities? Where are these conversations? The conversations itself are embedded in living spaces. And
also kind of like going back to their work, the inclusion of discussions around capital and labor. I mean, who has access to social media, right? Like when I was listening to your video yesterday, I was just thinking like, okay, yes, all of that, but how about those people working like 48 hours a day in the factory and not having access to any social media as a platform, right? So are we thinking of class and labor and capital when we are thinking of a space, a social media platform, right? And who has access to that, right? Who has an access to a haptic chair and who gets to wear the jacket and has the privilege to choose to escape reality, right? So bringing us back to the very basic questions of who has access and who has.
I'm just once again, I'm appreciating a lot today, but I'm appreciating the fact that we are not just launching like a critique against the capitalist regime, but also neoliberal spaces that, which we think apparently are very giving and,
pure spaces of being, right?
Which they are not. There are like layers of hierarchies within that, right? Of class, labor, gender, caste, community.
That we don't have solutions to.
Absolutely, we don't know what to do with them. And I think your paper is like a really new, very innovative entry point into that space of neoliberal.
I've just been. I don't
So many
know.
notes on that. Oh, God.
Yeah.
Show the camera all the notes. Yeah.
Yes.
I've been writing,
That's your
but I
process,
did have some.
we just gonna keep this for memory.
Okay, I did have some thoughts and some things I wanted to say.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Oh no.
Aw.
Heartbreaking.
Oh,
Oh no, she's back.
Let's go.
Okay. So, there are kind of a lot of pieces, but I do feel like they all fit together. So sorry if this feels a little scattered, at least at the beginning.
You started a lot of sentences that way.
Yeah, and generally it is scattered, but it always kind of knits together at the end. So, I actually started this when we were talking about healthcare, which was kind of a couple points ago. And it's like, why do we need to escape, right? What has been like kept from us that this is now necessary? What conditions are we in? And I think that this reminded me of two, or actually a couple of things. I'm not going to try to number it because it will never be the number that I say.
Never works.
The first thing is though, that like we are like very intentionally broken down by like labor and like kind of the like economic circumstances, the social circumstances that were put into, you know, the 40-hour work week, because we are more like pliant subjects, like ready to, like, we will get up and go to work, and by the time we get home, we're too exhausted to organize, you know, so we'll sit and, you know, doom scroll for a little bit and generate like ad revenue for Mark Zuckerberg, and then like go to sleep and get up the next morning, and we don't have time to be like people, so we become consumers. We read an article that described this as spiritual homelessness, which I think is pretty accurate. And the two things that this connects to for me is first, I want to cite Robin James for this, but I'm not sure. But the idea of austerity politics, which is
I can't remember the first name. The last name is Facts, and it's in 2016.
But the idea is that like we generate our communities of care because we need them, because we don't have the resources that we need. And the governments will use this as the justification for like cutting back on social programs and for like not prioritizing like accessibility and like healthcare, because we are like handling it ourselves. You know, it's our own job as like the individual neoliberal subject to like have networks of care. And it's kind of this, it's like a instrumentalization of our labor to justify like worsening social conditions, in that we'll handle it for ourselves. And there was a point I was going to make about that, but I don't remember what it was. So the next piece that connected to this for me was Moten and Harney in the intro to their book. The author, whose name I forget, is talking about like the deaths and the kind of manufacturing of death.
Sylvia Di Ferreira.
Yeah. In relation to the pandemic, which I think that Ragini brought up, but the phrasing that was used was like, in relation to the 2008 financial crisis, was these companies that were like too big to fail. What does that mean in contrast to people who are like too frail to live? You know, like the people that the process of forgetting or dehumanizing certain populations as already dead, as not figuring into our calculations, is kind of like, there is no way to conduct the kind of politics that are being conducted right now without that, because there's like this incessant and like algorithmic prioritization of those individuals and groups that are seen as like more productive. And I think that that plays really intensely into the way that media outlets are able to prioritize particular narratives and forget particular stories, because only certain like bodies and populations are able to figure into like our calculations of like death tolls. And so this, in a larger sense, I was thinking about what you were saying about like reconciliation, and it's like some things cannot be apologized for. Like there isn't reconciliation. These are lives lost and like potentials that are just gone. There's no going back, right? And I think not only is there not a form of reconciliation, but even the form that has been pursued is kind of what Holly was talking about, where they'll use, you know, the BBC broadcasters will use regional dialects to present the same thing, where it's lip service. It's an attempt to like integrate the kind of political authority into the language of the masses, so that we'll take the like kind of hard pill a little easier, because it's presented in a linguistic form that's more familiar to us. And I think that the role of the kind of analysis that we've all been doing in these kinds of like political settings is to deconstruct language, to understand the simulated nature of the discourse and connection and like reconciliation that's been offered to us, to see that that is not a liminal space, that is a simulation of a liminal space, that the presence of comforting language is there to cover up the absence of material action towards reconciliation, and that is what we should be pursuing, because it is what has not been presented to us. And I think we can see this. I mean, my knowledge is a lot more situated in American politics, because that's what the American education system teaches us. But I see it over and over again, right? We get certain members of the government that are apologizing for things like drone strikes or mistreatment of immigrants, like at the border camps. But these things don't stop between administration.
I don't even think they apologize for them. They put on some like, they just like go down to the border for a photo shoot, you know, let some tears run down, make sure they get a really nice photo of it.
I want to find the pictures.
No, like there's an A, like you'll find
but they never stop, right? And so it's just like, it's this desperate need to simulate like politics. it's like political improvement so that we believe in it. But it's all simulation.
I actually wanted to comment on the like smuggling the same old politics through different dialect thing. It reminds me a lot. Do you remember what the Kaluza article is titled?
Anarchism in Duluth.
Yes, Anarchism in Duluth. It was from 2019. I don't remember the person's first name, but the last name is Kaluza. And they make this point about how it's not enough to just change like theory or just change practice or change the form or just change the content, but rather that we need to change both the form and content, right? We can't smuggle the same old politics through through like new dialects, and we can't smuggle new like politics through old dialects, but we need to try and like find these new combinations, new ways of organizing and find ways of communicating the ideas and like reaching out to people. Because without doing both, you kind of are like left in this like awkward situation where it's like never enough and you can't get far enough, it seems. And before I forget, remind me later to send you the ebook of Berardi's new book. I think you'll really enjoy it.
Yes, please do. I think we should compile like a list of readings that we have discussed today. I would love to send out a Google Doc. We all can put in things that we have mentioned because it's hard to remember names and it escapes us. But
we can make a Google Drive and put
exactly. And I think Rohini would also have very interesting indigenous books to share, which
I'd
you
love
would
to
definitely like not get, like, you know, definitely not within the US, like, because I have also worked quite some on indigenous studies in India. We have better access to indigenous books over there, like, than you have here. So
yeah, it reminds me of our like departmental library, which our very dear professor, she like personally went to Canada, got back the books, paid for the plane fare, and built the library. Like it that has been a very like interesting process. So yeah, we do get access to some books, but again, a topic like the Indigenous residential school, there were like very less things that I could find.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
and because they presented a very theory heavy paper, it's wonderful to have the aspects of theoretical frameworks from their end. And as you say, you are educated as a part of the North American education system, and which has its pitfalls, but which also kind of provides a lot of frameworks to kind of, again, subvert the system and criticize it, right? So it's wonderful to have those books that talk about these institutions and reinstate them, and also kind of those works which criticize them and kind of like, you know, deconstruct them. So we need to have both to have our conversations. Which absolutely. Thank you. I don't have words. We all are a part of the. I mean, we all are the panel now. I don't want to like speak more.
Exactly.
It's wonderful to have a session like this. It's wonderful start to a day. It's wonderful in every possible way.
It's our first, like, for our first conference ever, I have to say.
Yeah, this was like the best, like this was amazing. Like,
We were sad. We were really sad at one point that everything went online. Rohini was supposed to be here in Vegas with me, like I miss her. We thought we would do things, we would participate, like, you know.
Let's blame the pandemic for this. Let's blame the pandemic. All the blame goes to the pandemic. I had all intentions of attending it.
Platforms, I have actually not seen such a fully fleshed out conversation in like a virtual setting, like this. I must say this, and I've attended a couple of conferences over the last 1 year, and I think Polemy will also like. Yeah,
I was pretty skeptical about this. I thought it was going to be like exactly 1.5 hours of like boring conversations. People,
like, you know,
you're like 40 minutes over time.
Went over time. We got another room.
It just kind of raised my standard of how a panel should be.
Right, exactly.
Now I don't know, like
now I want to prepare myself for tomorrow, like better. I want to do better tomorrow, like, you know, where I am presenting. So this pushes me. So thank you so much, everyone. I wish the other people were also here, but thank you so much. We also take a screenshot if
we gotta take a picture together.
So shift
let me just fix my hair then.
Shift command. Okay, maybe once more.
Wait,
do you want to do it?
Wait, shift command 3.
Yeah.
Yay!
All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you guys. It was lovely interacting with all of you.
It was a pleasure.
I know, Rohini, almost 12 in India, so you won't be able to stay for the next panel, but it would have been wonderful to have you. But I know it's going to be very, very late. So
Yeah,
hopefully you will
I wish I
connect.
could stay.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye, take care.
Do you want me to leave the call?
Yeah, we can leave the.
Okay.
Wow, what a rush.
I